What time do you want me to take it down?
I think if it's 2 o'clock, we need to start. Do we have sufficient people that have already linked?
The webinar hasn't started. I can start it now.
Okay.
So we'll put it up for a minute and then I'll take it down.
Okay. Just tell me when I can go then.
When it goes down, you go.
Okay. Musa, please don't forget. Good afternoon, everyone. And of course, Eid Mubarak to all Muslims. Welcome to part 2 of the KZN Floods webinar series. This part is titled Relief Measures and Sustainable Solutions, Supporting and Building Resilience in Communities Against a Backdrop of Climate Change. Unfortunately, Dr. Imtiaz Suleiman is unable to join us today, but he does leave us with some significant words of advice, which I will share later on, from who is fondly known as Captain South Africa. Of course, we all know that his actions do speak louder than all. I will return to the significance of actions later on as well. The potential for natural hazards to cause damage not only depends on the magnitude and frequency of the hazard, but also on how vulnerable and exposed a community or critical infrastructure is to such hazards. Informed by this quote by Krebeck et al. In a review of multiple hazards and risks in Germany, our guest list for today comprises of a series of high-profile managers from eThekwini, in addition to other valuable stakeholders. They will engage with us on sustainable solutions for KZN in our planning discussions. We sequence today's event with all speakers and first and questions thereafter, so we just don't run out of time like we did last week. The initial speakers will base their discussions on the immediate responses to the floods, followed by those who detail the coping strategies that were effective. Then we mine into ways to mitigate and reduce the effects of future hazards. Most importantly, plans for adaptation will be discussed, factoring in climate change and the crafting of an effective community-led disaster management plan, with some suggestions for policy and planning in the province. I note with concern the recent report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a body of scientists assembled by the United Nations, which interrogated the threats posed by global warming. It concluded that nations aren't doing nearly enough to protect cities, farms, and coastlines from the hazards that climate change has unleashed. They also document that between 2010 and 2020, droughts, floods, and storms killed 15 times as many people in highly vulnerable countries, including those in Africa and Asia. Those statistics are shocking. And I once again reiterate our focus here. The aim of this webinar is on sustainable solutions, building resilience in communities and in the city, with a key emphasis on disaster planning. Why? Because there has to be this urgency to be proactive, to avert an impending disaster. It's about us recognizing the depth of the impact for people, those who have lost their lives, their loved ones, and livelihoods, and those who remain on the fringes of society, temporarily housed in schools and community halls, facing an unknown future. Who can forget the Gogo who pleaded on national TV after the floods for a Singer sewing machine that doesn't use electricity so that she can regain her means of earning and provide for a family? So here, today, we must move beyond rhetoric and set in motion a series of actions. Let us acknowledge and take responsibility in this province for what has occurred, because it was inadequate to save the more than 400 lives that were lost. I'm going to now commence with Charles Samane, who will explain just not the impact of the floods, but why the Climate Justice Charter movement opened a case of culpable homicide against the president and others. Also cited in this docket were the KZN Premier and the Mayor of eThekwini. Charles is a researcher. He's an organizer at the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center. He has a master's from the University of Witwatersrand. He's an activist and a transformative feminist. Charles?
Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you for the invitation to be.
Charles, we can't hear you too clearly. Would you be able to turn your volume up, please?
Can you hear me now?
Still a little low, but I think it's bearable. Maybe if we could just have Musa, would you be able to tell us whether you can hear him clearly?
I'm able to hear him clearly.
Okay,
right.
Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Prof, for the invitation to be part of this platform. Let me just briefly touch on the work that we have been doing as the Climate Justice Charter movement. Having considered the multiple reports that have been released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as the Climate Justice Charter movement, we have for several years been calling on the government of this country to put South Africa on a climate emergency footing. In 2018, for example, we went together with 60 of our partners and we called on our national parliament to put South Africa on a climate emergency footing. Now, you remember this was after the release of the UN report dealing with a 1.5 degree increase. And we wanted Parliament to sit down and discuss the impacts of a 1.5 degree increase, especially on vulnerable communities in South Africa. Unfortunately, we were totally ignored by South Africa's Parliament. In 2019, after the devastating floods in KZN that killed, I believe, about 80 people, again, we called on the national government to declare a climate emergency and as well as a just transition plan for South Africa. But then again, we were ignored by the state. In 2020, during the height of the pandemic, we went back to Parliament and we called on Parliament to adopt the world's first climate justice charter, which has been endorsed by over 260 different organizations. Now, this is to put the country on a climate emergency footing to deal with the impacts of climate change. Unfortunately, again, we were ignored by the state. Working together with some of our leading climate activists in South Africa who have been part of the IPCC process for years, we developed a climate risk document detailing vulnerabilities across the country. And we took this document to Parliament last year. Again, we were calling for government to put the country on a climate emergency footing and to make sure that we take the climate crisis into all planning in all government departments. Unfortunately, again, we were ignored by the government. And now we feel that we can no longer hide this under the banner of a natural disaster because it is simply not. The years of ignorance as well as lack of action by the government must be held to account. And that is why we ultimately took this case, because unfortunately in South Africa, to get the government to listen, you have to do one of two things. One, you either have to have a violent protest that destroys property and commits all kinds of criminality, or you have to resort to litigation. And that is the option we have taken. Litigation is a tedious process, but unfortunately, we have no other option because we have to force the government to take the climate emergency serious in all of its planning and in all of its adaptation measures. Because all the reports that have been released this year, in fact, the report released last year, the physical basis of climate change report, the two reports that have been released this year, the climate change adaptation and vulnerability that came out in August, as well as the mitigation of climate change reports that came out in April, they all make it very clear that we are going to see climate catastrophes like this increasing in scale and increasing in magnitude. Now, we can no longer rely on reactive measures. We need proactive steps that need to be taken. We need risk reduction measures, which are more important than your emergency relief measures, because risk reduction is proactive. And now we know it's not as if we are caught unaware. We know that these climate shocks are going to increase in magnitude, they are going to increase in severity. So we need to focus on vulnerability risk assessment, especially for the most vulnerable people in rural areas across the country. We need to focus on land development. We need to focus on housing. We need to focus on climate infrastructure. Climate infrastructure such as the maintenance of stormwater drainages, such as educating communities about floodplains. All of those things have to be scaled up because unfortunately the floods that we saw in KZN, they are not a once-off appearance. They are going to increase in frequency, they are going to increase in severity. So we need to focus on climate infrastructure, but unfortunately, we have not seen the South African government, and our focus as the Climate Justice Charter movement is nationwide. We have not seen the South African government taking the climate crisis seriously as it should have. Instead, we have seen the South African government pursuing the gas amendment bill, which we opposed, the upstream petroleum development bill, which we also opposed, because all of these bills are simply enlarging the legal infrastructure for a carbon-based economy, one that is making South Africa more reliant on fossil fuels and emitting more greenhouse gases. Now, due to this failure to take the climate crisis seriously, even though our own government has been part of the COP process for about 3 decades now, part of the Paris Climate Accord, but all of those things have failed to materialize on the ground. And as you said in your opening, we are way past the rhetoric. It is now time for action. And unfortunately, we have not seen this action. We did not see it when we were campaigning in 2014, calling for the government to help communities affected by drought in the Eastern Cape, and in fact in KZN and in many areas across the country, when we were marching with many subsistence local farmers who lost everything due to drought. So these climate emergencies that are increasing in frequency and severity, the South African government has dismally failed to take them seriously. Hence, we have then laid a criminal charge. So we've been calling for the government to implement risk assessments for vulnerable communities, many who have lost everything with these floods. We've been calling on the government to put the entire country on a climate emergency footing. Today, the focus is on KZN. Tomorrow, the focus will be on another region. It cannot be. We need the whole nation to be put on a climate emergency footing. We need to assess the infrastructure the country over. We cannot have bridges that are simply washed away. We cannot have storm drainages that are simply not being maintained. We saw that in Lady Smith at the beginning of this year, contributing a lot to the disaster there. So in order to deal with the emergency that we have now, we need a systems approach, one that cannot simply be focused on floods, because tomorrow it will be droughts. Another time it's going to be fires and so on and so forth, many climate emergencies and disasters. So as the Climate Justice Charter movement, we've been consistently calling on the government to take the climate emergency seriously and to put the country on a climate emergency footing. And now we feel that it is time to hold them to account for failing to take the climate crisis seriously. And they cannot hide this under the carpet as another natural disaster, because it is simply not. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Charles. So as we can tell from Charles, and the Climate Justice Charter movement is holding government accountable, and they're calling for a climate emergency footing for South Africa. But once again, this is just one lens. And of course, there are numerous lenses that we can take to the discussion. I also note the comments on the side. The policies are there, as we can tell from what Charles has outlined to us. We have to think carefully about the action that we are going to take. In particular, the Sustainable Development Goals, and here Goal 13 is important, which says, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. So that's coming in from an international footing, and countries have agreed to this, that climate change is increasing the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, such as droughts, floods, tropical cyclones, etc. All of this will damage critical infrastructure, interrupting the provision of basic services. What we are not saying, and I hear this clearly came from the last webinar as well, is that the floods are only due to climate change. What we're saying is that climate change has intensified what is occurring. We've already established last week that there were a whole set of other factors, meteorology, geology, etc. So let's move on now to the next speaker, Mr. Linda Mbonambi. Mr. Mbonambi is an urban and regional planner who is currently the head of the city's area-based management unit and acting chief operating officer at eThekwini Municipality. Mr. Mbonambi, I know you work very closely as well with the School of Education in terms of community engagement. Please tell us, what is it that we can learn from these floods? What do we recognize as the fault lines? So Charles has already pointed out some of the fault lines to us in terms of holding the South African government and in terms of the climate crisis and holding them responsible. Please tell us what were some of your experiences and what do you see as the fault lines in our existing strategies, or is there an absence of strategies? Mr. Mbonambi.
Please unmute, Linda.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. All right. I have a presentation prepared. Is it possible, Prof, to show it?
Yes, please go ahead and share your screen.
All right. I will have to. All right. In sharing my screen, I just have to go to my files, right? Okay. Can I just get clarity here? Do you? I sent the presentation to you. Would you like to?
Yes.
Share what
yes.
I sent?
Would you like me to share it?
Yes, please, so it will move faster.
Okay, give me a second.
Whilst Prof is sharing my creating the link to the few notes that I thought I must share, I really want to use the minutes that a few seconds to acknowledge Mr. Charles Simane's views, and also just to say, having been introduced, I want to say that you'd recall, Prof did say I am from Durban, working at the eThekwini Municipality. I just want to say, talking from the eThekwini Municipality experience, the city has really been in the forefront for the past 2 decades in forward thinking around issues of climate change, climate mitigation, and climate adaptation. And it will be interesting to, other colleagues of mine are still going to come and clarify some of the ways in which we are working on issues of climate change. But I want to just say this, that I took interest in what Mr. Simane was saying, that in this country, in order to be able to make your voice heard, you must either protest violently or go through the litigation route. In this city, we pride ourselves on being a city that says to people, not protest, instead of protesting, start proposing. So what I'm going to be presenting, I'm presenting the experience of how this culture of proposing and enabling people who propose to take action has really been of great assistance and opportunity for us in the backdrop, against the backdrop of these floods that we've had. So, Prof, please just give each slide maybe 10 seconds. I'll move fast. I know that.
Linda, perhaps
Yes.
what you can do is, can I go to the next slide? Can you see it clearly?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, then just
Right.
tell me when to move it for you.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. I think what is would like just to share is that there have been several declarations relating to the floods that we've had. One is the declaration that this flood, the heaviness of it, has really resulted in government recognizing it as a national disaster instead of being a regional or provincial disaster. And I think when I'm thinking about what Charles Simane is saying, that we need to locate the problems that we are currently having, not just at a regional or provincial level, but at national level. We are starting to see areas of opportunity and possibility here. The Premier of the province, Mr. Zikalala, has presented this as has taken extraordinary measures, making sure that we deal with the situation very decisively, understanding the scale, the magnitude, the severity of the floods that have experienced, and also the reconstruction rehabilitation measures that are needed. It has become very, very important for government to think in a different way around how we are dealing with it. For example, you know that on the 13th of April, provincial government did an assessment, completed it. By the 17th of April, a national disaster was declared. Can you just go down? Sorry. You can proceed, Prof, to the next slide. Okay. This is what our Minister of Cooperative Governance and International Affairs, Dr. Nkosazana Zuma, declared in terms of the disaster. I'm just showing it to flight it of how serious this government is in thinking broadly and proactively about such issues. Just to, I'm also just making a reference to what Mr. Simane was saying. This is, these weather events have had serious replications, not just only for municipal areas in KwaZulu-Natal, but in the Eastern Cape and other provinces. And so, yes, I agree with him. Let's locate this as a national issue, not a provincial issue. Go down, please. Next slide. One of the important issues that I must really emphasize is that, which is our approach as government, is that the disaster we're experiencing require everyone in the system, in the ecosystem, to play their role in terms of unlocking and responding in terms of their mandates. For example, we have seen vigorous communication efforts across all different platforms, the messaging, call for help, giving feedback to the public, because there was a lot of panic. We have seen the introduction of amazing humanitarian support. The UN was here, different national business organization was here. We even had support from the other cities, like the Western Cape province came with support to ensure that we are able to work together to deal with this catastrophe. So working together has been one of the biggest part of this approach. I've mentioned obviously the UN humanitarian support, which was evident and has taken us far in terms of being able to be responsive. All other clusters in the city have played their role. The finance cluster, the community and emergency services cluster, which houses the disaster management plan and the disaster management unit. We have had, in some instances, we have had to decant schools to make them to be places of shelter. Burial packages have been made available to people who have lost almost everything in terms of the catastrophe that happened. Our engineering unit the Human Settlements Unit in terms of coming up with a way of creating temporary housing and shelter. That is on the cards. And I think in terms of the approach, we've really been robust, and our city manager is talking about the need in the future to focus a lot on high-rise building instead of allowing our citizens or to locate themselves in any piece of land that's available. Because what we do know is that a number of areas that were affected by this are areas where citizens have located their houses along the floodplain, the 100-year floodplain in the main, a place where people shouldn't be building. But we also, geologists and meteorologists, as you have said, facilitator, another lens that they are providing is the soil type in which some of these settlements and even houses, formal houses, have been built, which exacerbated the problem that we have. Obviously, this flood has had catastrophic impact in terms of the economy. So part of our response is to do due diligence in terms of understanding the economic impact and moving swiftly to support businesses that have been affected, big and small. Obviously, we've had huge disturbances in terms of access to electricity, water, and also services regarding cleaning and solid waste management. And those are issues that have really ensured that as a city, we work together with all other sectors to ensure that we address the issues. Can you go down?
I'd love to go down, Linda. The problem is we're running out of time.
Okay.
Would you like me to go to your last slide? I'll give you a minute to round up.
Yeah, please. You can just show those slides though as you go down, because I think the reason why I showed the slides, it was just to give people a marathon of the kind of issues, the prioritization issues. Go down, repairing. Look at the level of impact the flooding has caused. The major infrastructure, look at the substation, which is in water, which is the reason why many areas experience. Look at the economic impact, the connectivity, the bulk supply damages, water supply. So in concluding, so one of the important factors that has really helped us in the last 2 weeks of flooding has been to get the intergovernmental plan in place. We've organized visits to various affected families and areas and regions. We have had leadership from ministers to the premier, mayor, the councillors, visits from business leaders. We've also unlocked psychological support from different entities. UKZN social workers have been on the ground. Our social workers from the Department of Social Welfare, DSD rather, have been on the ground through vouchers of SASSA relief. A number of different families who've been affected have been provided support. And finally, profile communities. As a city, we don't work alone, we work with communities. So it has been very much helpful to profile people who are affected, but also to use the different profiles that we've been using over the years to unlock support. So in a nutshell, all this presentation that it seeks to say is that let's not, the blame game must stop. It's a time for us to start to work together. It's time for us to create a single plan. Already the government has started with a district model where it seeks to bring everyone on board, from government, public, business, academia, communities, importantly, to ensure that our development is centered on people. Thank you very much.
Sorry, so sorry, Linda, but we've got quite a number of your colleagues, and I'm sure they're going to extend on your discussion as well. So I'm going to move to Jeff Tooley. Jeff Tooley is a professional engineer with more than 32 years of experience in civil engineering. He's also located in coastal, at eThekwini in coastal stormwater and catchment management. He has experience in project management, asset management and design, etc. And I was quite interested to hear from Jeff that urban drainage didn't fail, but there were challenges related to other aspects. And I'm hoping that he's going to take us through this to tell us what went horribly wrong and what his department is doing to reduce risk and forecasting. I'd love for him at all, Jeff, if possible, to comment on Umshloti, the small village that was devastated by floods and landslides in terms of drainage. We know there's a few new developments that are taking place there as well. So if you could work that into your presentation, that will be fantastic.
Thanks, Sadhana. You're throwing curveballs at me, and I'm not prepared to answer that question on an open forum like this.
Okay, do what you can, Jeff. You know, we like to put people on the spot here because we want answers and we need action.
Okay. No, I agree. I fully agree that we need actions, and I'm going to go fairly quickly. I haven't put a lot of slides with put pictures together, and I want to talk to these pictures, but I want to start off with if I can get this to move. There we go. Climate change has got a role to play, but it's not all about climate change. And I think we need to be careful that we don't fall into the trap of blaming everything on climate change. And I put the slide up. We were anticipating a big event. We didn't know when it, we don't have a crystal ball, so we don't know when it is going to occur. And this is just a timeline of large recorded floods, which came very shortly after recorded droughts in KZN. And these are linked with cutoff lows, weather systems, which is typical of what caused the 2022 storm. And I think we need to understand that we've got the stats, we've got the history, we've got the science. We know climate is going to impact. We're asking the question, is it only going to be on the small cell impacts, rainfall impacts like we saw in 2017, which was a localized cell that hit the southern basin? Or are we going to see more of these bigger weather systems? And there's still a debate happening as to what are the timelines between these big events and how much is linked to climate change. So having said that, we are aware of climate change. We are incorporating it into our planning with our flood studies, and we are looking at the impact of climate change on those. And we use those flood studies to help facilitate where we develop and where we don't develop. But I want to show you something and take you back, because nature's got a wonderful way of reminding us sometimes how insignificant we are as humans, but how it can have an impact on us and we can have an impact on it. These valleys were created long before we existed, and these type of events happened. And I want to show you this video very quickly. It's a helicopter trip. This was the Tuesday after the event. You can see Inanda Dam is overflowing, but have a look at the hillside as it pans across. You can see this big erosion that's occurred here. There's not a lot of human development above, but there is a massive amount of material that's come off the hillside. And this erosion and the failure of this hillside is a result of natural processes that exist when you have an extreme amount of rainfall over a long period. The challenge comes in is that we as humans start developing downstream of these areas, and we're not always cognizant of the impact that these natural processes are going to have on us when we develop. Here you can see some houses here, and the stream actually changed its course. And we know that streams change their course. So in our planning, in our urban planning that we work on, we need to, sorry, I'm jumping around here because the video isn't working so well. But we need to be aware of what are these natural processes and how do we incorporate them into our urban planning. But also, having said that, you can't plan for everything. And this is in a built-up formal area where these are approved properties, approved building plans. But what it highlights is the importance that when we develop in these areas, wherever we develop, that we have proper building plans, that we have proper engineering input into the design of where we build and how we build. We don't know the exact cause of this failure, but you can see it started up at the top here where you've got banks failure. And when you've got saturated soils where the water seep through down to the rock and you've got water flowing just above the rock level, moving finer particles out, leaving the smaller, the bigger particles in, which ultimately end up like the ball bearings, you you end up with failures, and you end up with, all you need is one small bank failure at the top. And what this does is trigger a failure all the way down. And what it does is it takes houses with it. This is in Westfield. These houses have been here 40, 50 years. They've withstood many previous localized storms and impacts. But what caused these failures? That will come out in the investigation. But it highlights the importance of proper urban planning and proper engineering input when we develop in these areas. This is out towards Nagina. Same thing. Why did this house end up down the hill and not these houses? When you have events this big, when you have in excess of 300 or 360 mils in a 24-hour period, you are going to end up with situations where you have bank failures, where you have these type of failures, but you don't have a crystal ball about where they're going to fail. So I think it's important. The learning out of this is the key that we've seen in the past, a lot of informality. And I'm talking about informality not only in terms of informal settlements, I'm talking about informality on people's cadastral sites, where they build things without building plans. They build banks and they build retaining walls without engineering input. And there needs to be an understanding that if we do this, we are placing not only ourselves and our families at risk, but we're placing our neighbors at risk as well. This isn't just about government doing something. This is about government and community together getting it right. And I think the challenge that we always have, if we all sit back and wait for government to do stuff for us, we're going to be waiting for a long time, and we're not going to see the picture that we want. So that's, and I think what also these pictures are showing us is, I haven't seen what the split is, but a large portion of the deaths were related to the drowning deaths, so related to flooding and people living in floodplains, but a large portion of them were resultant with landslips. You saw the size of those rocks that come down. When a hillside comes down, you're talking houses that are boulders that are nearly as big as houses, and that is what has killed a lot of people too. So it's not just about the flooding; it's about the landslips that have happened in terms of the split. So I've talked about the instability issues that we see within our urban framework. But another thing that we've seen, a lot of damage to our infrastructure, and I heard a comment about, no, we've got to make sure that the bridges are big enough. It's not only about how big the bridges are. This is in Pinetown and Caversham Road, a key infrastructure transport route. There's a culvert over here, and you can see the debris that is built up against it. This culvert blocked, and what happened is the water then couldn't get through the culvert. It silted up, and it jumped out, and it went through these businesses and damaged the road, washed the road out.
Jeff,
but I want you to look
back to that picture for a second. I remember you telling me about the drainage problems and plastic pollution and alien vegetation. Would you be able to just maybe speak to that a little?
Yep, that's what this picture's about. So if you look carefully here, we originally always used to blame the waste and the pollution, and it does have a role to play. But if you look at the size of most of this plastic pollution, this culvert, there's a 3-cell culvert under here. That is a 3 meter by 3 meter hole, each of them. And these bottles would have gone through that culvert quite comfortably if it hadn't been for this vegetation that had caught here and caused the original blockage. And then this debris then blocks up all the small holes. So it's a combination of this vegetation and solid waste. But what we started to see is that a lot of this vegetation is alien vegetation. It's fast growing, shallow root system. We end up with, this gets ripped out of the river banks very easily. It exposes large areas for erosion. We end up with, that's why you see so much sand in the rivers. And that then goes down the river, blocks the culvert, which probably would have coped. It might have had some overtopping, but not nearly the damage that we saw, that we've seen in this actual process. And you can see how much vegetation. There are big tree stumps that have gone in here. Now, what we're seeing is where the alien vegetation exists, and this gets washed out, the trees are now being undermined. The trees then fall in the river, and they add to this blockage. And you can see, if you look carefully, the size of the actual tree stumps that have been shunted into these culverts, and you can see the size of the openings underneath here. So what we're seeing is that this damage is a result of urban riverine management that is required. And Sean's going to touch on the transformative river management program we're looking at. And we're doing about 500 kilometers in Umlazi and KwaMashu. And interesting, we saw less damage in those areas than we did in these areas. And it's primarily because we're getting the alien vegetation and the solid waste out of our river systems. But this is where the communities play their role. It's the communities that throw the waste on the floor. It's the communities that allow alien vegetation to grow in their properties. So it's not just about government doing this. It's about government and community working together. This is another example. This is a Sapingo. And if you look carefully, you can see the amount of plastic debris. But unfortunately, this picture doesn't show it. What's caused this blockage is actually the alien vegetation that's stuck against it. And we've got more and more pictures of this. This is the Erica Avenue entrance to Yellowwood Park. You can see the debris. This is a 5 or 6 meter high bridge, and it's been blocked by vegetation and a lot of Spanish reed you can see in here. And ultimately that bridge is now no more. So you can see here, this is a pipe bridge, and you can see the debris built up on the bridges. This is under one of the highways, and you can see the debris here built up against the culvert. This is a video, I hope it comes out. I'm standing in the streamline. So this is the other impact that happens. You see how much silt and debris, but there's a culvert behind me, and hopefully this plays. The stream is no longer in the stream. It's now flowing where the road is and through the private property. The sediment is about 3 meters high. You can see now the alien vegetation and the debris that is actually blocked. The culvert is underneath that sand. You can see there, that's where the channel, the culvert is actually under here. That's the channel where the water used to flow. So these are examples that we're showing. This is another one. This is a Blundell Road. Exactly the same thing. The debris has blocked the culvert, so the water can't go through. So what it's done is it's now flowed around the culvert and washed out the road. So it's not just about size and capacity of systems. It's about how we maintain and manage our river systems.
Jeff,
that's interesting. So Donna, I'm nearly
sorry.
finished.
Okay, I'd like you just to talk as well a little bit about the projects that you have, the programs that you have.
Okay, I'm going to, Sean and I chatted, so he's going to touch a bit. So I'm just going to set the scene for him. This is actually on the Palmead River. And you can see, yes, we've got debris build-up here. But there's been a program to take out alien vegetation. So as much as we saw some blockage, we didn't see complete blockage, and therefore the road is still whole. This is now the Palmead Quarry Road Informal Settlement. We have an early warning system that we worked with the community and through the university. It's a community-based early warning system. The city, we have a system where we track storms, and we've got rain gauges and river gauges on the river upstream of this area. And we have, through the varsity's work with the community, developed hazard maps. They've developed hazard maps, and the community understands the risks associated with flooding and fire. And we were feeding information into this community, and so they were aware of the danger of what was coming, and we could give them warnings into the community. But what happened at about 8 o'clock, at about 5:30, these bridges were still clear. And they were not being, the water was going through, the river was high, but it wasn't impacting. People had moved a lot of their belongings away, they'd moved their children away, their personal documents were in plastic bags, and they were monitoring the situation. At about 8 o'clock, we had a peak, and the debris was brought down, and you can see the vegetation in here. If you look carefully, you see all the plastic bottles, but you see the vegetation again. What happened, this blocked, and the river jumped out of the water course, and it went around here. It took about 60, 70 dwellings out of this area. Fortunately, we never lost one life out of this area. We lost one life, unfortunately, through the drowning. We lost one life through electrocution because of illegal electricity connections in there.
Jeff, sorry.
I'm finished now. That's it.
Okay.
I'm done.
That was
Thank you very much.
fantastic. Thank you so much. And let's move on to a colleague of yours as well. But before I get to Sean, I'd like to ask Helen. Helen Epstein, and she is from the strategic planning branch of eThekwini Municipality. Helen has had a long focus on long-term strategic and spatial planning. She's maintained an interest in supporting environmental and climate justice issues. Helen, tell us about how you're working towards inclusive, resilient, and integrated planning before we speak to Sean Donoghue.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Prof. Sean is sharing his presentation, so I'm unable to share mine. Thanks.
Okay, sorry, Helen. There we go. You can try now, Helen. Sorry, Helene. I must remember to pronounce your name properly. Okay. You are
I'm trying to share it.
Yes, you are sharing it. It's just that it's coming up as multiple segments. So maybe just click on the first one, double click on the first one, or just go to a slideshow and start from the beginning. Maybe that would.
Okay.
There. Okay, that looks a little better.
Are you seeing the full slides or two?
Helene, we're seeing your page, not the actual show. Yeah, you need to swap it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Right. Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Okay, so I'll have to just adjust things because it's now showing on a different screen. So good afternoon, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I'll be looking at spatial planning and in the context of building resilience in communities against backdrop of climate change. And I do appreciate that this isn't only as a result of climate change, that comment is acknowledged. So without repeating what everybody is currently aware of, you know, Professor Francois Engelbrecht has described these floods as the worst floods experienced in South Africa in 100 years, with no precedent for the nature of the flood event. And this brings risk and vulnerability sharply into focus, with many of us now asking questions about what has the city been doing to reduce the risk? Is it effective? What are the challenges? And perhaps we could be asking, what is the actual cause? And how do we scale up mitigation and adaptation if indeed these are the only required responses? So what we've seen now is obviously focus will be on immediate relief, with a lot of organizations involved in mapping critically affected areas. And I see, yes, mapping of critically affected areas and focusing on the relief of people in high-risk areas, so that obviously we can identify areas of high risk and compare them to previous events as well. So this information and data will be most important. So from a planning perspective, what is it that we've been doing? How do we attempt to protect the critical open space resources? So from a spatial planning or long-term planning perspective, our open space and biodiversity layer has been one of the key informants in our spatial plans. All our land use plans will aim to protect the biodiversity plan for the city. However, having said that, these are highly contested spaces, and we do experience a lot of pressure for the development of these areas, particularly from private sector development, but also as a result of encroachment from informal settlements, illegal developments, and the need for delivery of housing and for human settlement upgrading purposes. Another area of focus of the municipality has been around catchment-based planning, and as you can see, catchments or water-based catchments, water catchments transcend the administrative boundaries of the eThekwini municipality. So Any catchment planning that looks at land uses associated with the capacity of the catchment, the quality of the water, the quantity, will obviously require collaboration with neighboring municipalities. But one of the areas in which we have looked at microcatchments, in fact, in 2005, ironically, in response to coastal erosion and the loss of roads and parking areas and recreational areas in our coastline, the city undertook what we call a local area plan between the Tlanga River and the Tangati River in the north of Durban. And instead of just looking at land-based planning, we also combined this with coastal management in an effort to achieve a much more integrated approach to the interface between land use planning and coastal planning. And interestingly enough, if you go back to this plan, it recognizes and acknowledges that this coastal dune, and this is the picture of the Umhloti area where there was a huge landslide or landslip. The plans themselves, while the underlying information that was used was included information on landslides, flood risk, slope stability. So this was in fact taken into consideration. And I guess what we're asking ourselves now then, is how did this happen? Why did this happen? Is this a case of, does the data need to be reviewed and updated? Is this inappropriate scale and intensity of development? Is the development setback sufficiently at the dune? Could the cause of this slope failure, in fact, have been from other sources? For instance, a contributing factor could be the construction that we see in the picture behind the residential area. So it's important, I think, this demonstrates the importance of us analyzing each and every event to understand the actual cause. Was this poor planning, poor stormwater management, poor infrastructure, or simply a combination of a variety of things that we need to do differently? And in the first webinar, we had references made to the bluff and the controlled area regulations and the need to review them. Perhaps they're not sufficiently stringent, but also we could consider extending them to this area to address the entire length of the coastline, as well as what commonly occurs as illegal developments and dune encroachments, which are often also the result of some of these slip failures. Taking this a step further, our spatial planning has looked at integrating climate-proof urban planning, and we've done this through a number of sector plans around water, sea level rise, energy, food security, and transport, etc. So we've devised an implementation plan around a number of themes. Now, if you look at the recommendations that were made for water and land use planning, two issues were identified. That was the need for key water management and watershed areas being managed, identified and managed, and identifying open spaces that provide protection from flooding. So these considerations around anticipated flood events have already been factored into our spatial planning, and in fact have now been incorporated into our eThekwini climate action plan and our vulnerability assessments. Now, whilst this event did not spare anyone, either formal or informal, as you can see from the pictures that Jeff posted, formal areas were badly affected, infrastructure, stormwater, etc. I think by far the impact has been felt most keenly by the poor and most vulnerable in our society. And we understand the challenges of people trying to identify and locate land that is well located and close to job opportunities. Unfortunately, urbanization and migration will continue to put pressure on the municipality's ability or capacity to deliver services. But some of the things that we have in fact done, that we are doing currently, and I hope I'm not stepping on my colleagues' toes by talking to this issue, the person who will be dealing with the housing issues, but just to make reference to the fact that our long-term spatial plans try to address spatial transformation. try to support spatial equity and justice. And in doing so, the plans promote compact, integrated, and sustainable development. So the plans have, up till now, identified or spatially target both new areas and infill residential opportunities at varying densities and locations. And these have been identified on the basis that they provide good access to social, health, recreational, and economic opportunities and transport opportunities. So nodes, corridors, integrations, excuse the jargon, but these are the planning terminology, but essentially trying to provide residential opportunities in areas that provide good opportunities for other resources. And we experienced these challenges with acquiring this well-located land. And what the city has done is they've adopted a new approach based on the understanding that we won't be able to address the housing challenges under the current subsidy program. So this new approach includes basically the categorization and incremental upgrading of informal areas, as well as parallel to other housing delivery strategies. And this particular approach that was recently adopted on the 30th of September 2019 has also been informed by the Durban's resilience strategy, in which developed a resilience building collaborative informal settlements action plan. As part of the resilience strategy, informal settlements were identified as the most vulnerable and at-risk population. So this has been the starting point for identifying this new approach to informal settlements upgrading. And I'm hoping that what you can see on the screen, are the different categories, which include full upgrade, incremental upgrade, deferred relocation, and category C is the most important because these were the 400 odd people that tragically lost their lives. These are the 40,000 people who have been displaced because they fall in the category C, where immediate relocation is required. They're in floodplains, they're in steep slopes, they're in areas considered to be high risk, particularly from flooding, but also from for other factors. So what is the spatial planning solution? We will be mapping, instead of just mapping residential areas as a generic land use, we will in fact be specifically referring to informal settlements, the different categories, and we'll be incorporating what we consider to be a risk-averse approach into our city spatial plans. Hopefully also reviewing bylaws and town planning schemes to accommodate this. But this approach is not without its shortcomings, and I think it's important for me to mention that this approach may result in the upgrading of informal settlements that are currently not contributing to spatial transformation, but they've been in existence for a long time. So the approach doesn't address the location. It does not address poor location or the distance from opportunities. And some are in fact on very steep slopes. So there will need to be assessments on slope stability and floodline assessments to determine whether or not it's appropriate to upgrade them in situ. In addition to this, I think this particular plan that we've undertaken is the Urban Design Climate Change Lab for Isipingo. This is the Isipingo, it was an Isipingo urban regeneration plan was developed. And in the picture, the arrow is pointing at an informal settlement that was a transit camp. But adjacent to that on the right, the area that's flooded is Prospect, and a huge industrial area with the sort of engines of the municipal economy. And these areas frequently experience flood conditions under extreme rainfall. So this particular plan looked at assessing the vulnerabilities such as flooding, which we know to happen in this area, in a much wider area. So it's not focused purely on the informal settlements, it's looking at it in a geographic space. And it particularly in this example looked at issues of water in 2019 and what are the predicted floods and water situation in 2015, and the development of scenarios for adapting existing design frameworks such as the local area plan. Unfortunately, or perhaps I could just say I'm not entirely sure of the extent to which this plan has been implemented. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges we face is the speed and scale and extent to which we actually implement and align our planning decisions and our plans. And then just finally, this is an initiative that is currently underway. It's just started. It's called the Green Book Metro View for eThekwini Municipality. It's taking all the information that we have on disasters, vulnerability, floodlines, heat, urban, heat islands, a whole variety of information, downscaling the climate change projections and undertaking settlement profiling, looking at all the hazards, the adaptation and the risks. So this project will be the sort of melting point or culmination of all the information plus more, with the ultimate intent of developing online and interactive planning tools to support decision making and hopefully minimizing and reducing risk for the municipality. So these are some of the tools that we're currently undertaking to address adaptation and mitigation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. If you could just stop sharing your screen for a second, please. Okay, we now move to Dr. Sean Donoghue, and Dr. Donoghue will be speaking to the eThekwini Municipality and climate change. In a 2015 paper by Leck and Roberts, they assert that Durban's Municipal Climate Protection Program is the first of its kind in South Africa to focus predominantly on adaptation. And hopefully we're going to have Dr. Donoghue speak to this climate protection plan, and he's going to elaborate a little more on what Jeff has already covered earlier in terms of the programs that eThekwini Municipality has and what can be upscaled as well. Dr. Donoghue.
Yeah, thanks very much, Professor Manek. Yeah, no, this is not about the Durban climate change strategy, but I can say a few words about it. We have an implementation plan associated with the strategy, which we reviewed for the first full 5-year term recently, and that's going to council for approval. So what I'm talking about here would be some of the projects in the implementation plan. This is a presentation, an abridged version of a presentation that I gave to Minister Barbara Creasy when she visited our project on Friday. So I was able to just use this quite conveniently. And it's a story about the Palmeet catchment rehabilitation program, obviously in the Palmeet catchment, and it has a number of shared stakeholders, academia, UKZN, Quarry Road West Informal Settlement community leaders, NGOs, civil society, and of course eThekwini Municipality. So it's very much a shared approach to governance and decision making in the catchment. And here we see it took us a long time for the stakeholders in the catchment not to look to the government, what the government was going to do for the project, but how we can collectively address the issues in the catchment. And so that picks up on the theme of what Jeff was saying. It's very much about what we can do as partnerships in the city. Within that project, we have the EnviroChamps working, and they do this great work around fixing leaks and reporting sewage incidents, removing alien invasive plants, removing litter and that. And we saw from Jeff's presentation how important it is to manage these streams. And you know, Jeff also showed a picture higher up in the catchment where there was less damage. Unfortunately, that didn't sort of transfer right down to the bottom of the catchment, which was receiving all these waters and all 32 kilometers of the stream. But an important part of this discussion we're having is the forecast early warning system. Jeff talked about it. It's a formal system in the city that is able to measure rainfall happening real time as well as stream levels. And what we've done as the project here is to be able to take that information and transfer and help the community get the information. So this is very much an informal WhatsApp network attached to a formal system that I will talk about. This is the Quarry Road West informal settlement at the bottom of the catchment, and this is where the river enters into. The picture that Jeff showed was just down in the bottom left corner of your screen, and this is obviously in happier times. This is an important area here, as well as the depth of the houses in the settlement. On Monday afternoon, when the river was rising, my climate scientist, Misa Bengu, and Kathy Sutherland, a professor from UKZN, were in the community translating the messages sent by Jeff, who was sitting at home giving us the information, even though during load shedding the radar went down and there was all sorts of complications. But we were able to use that information, and Smiso and Catherine put up tape along the settlement showing where the danger areas were, and we were able to evacuate community members so that when this river, which was blocked, overtopped and went around the bridge, taking out that settlement that I said was important, that corner of the settlement, causing that damage. Remember, this is what it looked like before, and this is what it looked like after. It was over 400 dwellings that were lost, and as Jeff correctly pointed out, none of those were lost due to flooding, and that's only because Smiso and Kathy were using this information that Jeff was sending real time to us and connecting with the community. And so that's one of the big lessons, is we have this great forecast early warning system in the city, but we need to connect it to the users. There was a question on the chat was, what about awareness in communities? And that's absolutely critical. Having an ability to work with informal settlement and other communities in catchments is absolutely critical to us avoiding loss of life, as shown here in this case. The loss of land, people have nowhere to build now. So that's an important, how we respond to these things after the event. Where did the people go? The MEC on Friday made commitments to the community members around a response, and we'll follow up on that. Also, after the event, what are the sustainable approaches? Jeff mentioned the Transformative River Management Program, and it's built on eThekwini, Sihlanzi, and Velo program, very similar to what I showed with the EnviroChamps, looking after the catchments and making sure that, if we get communities to do it, and that's what this Sihlanzi is all about, cooperatives of 5 kilometer, managing 5 kilometer stretches of stream, we've shown that this can actually save us money by doing it this way rather than traditional management of streams. And we did this by doing a cost benefit analysis on the Ohlanga catchment in the city. And what we found, depending on the land class ownership there is, because obviously there's municipal owned land, private owned land, and land under traditional governance, for every rand we spend, we can save between R1.80 and R3.40. We get those in benefits, whether it's avoided damage to culverts that Jeff showed, or whether it's in ecosystem services benefits or creating jobs. If we invest 7.5 billion over 20 years, we can create over 9,000 of these jobs, which not only helps reduce damage during flooding events, but it creates wealth. It supports a just transition as well. And when we add on to that additional green economy opportunities, we can make these paving stones out of dirty plastic from the rivers. And that is happening now. We have these paving stones. We have green concrete, a company by the name of Durban Green Corridor. It's a non-profit company associated with the city is doing this now. So what we are missing at the moment is an ability to scale this up massively to all 7,000 kilometers in the streams, but also to do it outside of Durban. It's something that many African cities are getting on board with. We're having Harare, we're having Mombasa within South Africa, we're having Cape Town, Mbombela, Stellenbosch. Quite a number of cities are now taking this on. And that's the story I want to leave here, Sarana, is this, we have the tools to deal with these events, but we're going to need a substantial ability to coordinate formal with informal across different scales, even to farm scale as well. It's going to be so very, very important. But we have all these benefits we can get from doing this type of preventative management. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. Sean, I want to throw a commitment on behalf of the university. You're already working with Kathy Sutherland, and she's an amazing person. She's been doing a lot of good work. But I can assure you that you can count as many academics in, because we're researchers as well. And I know that there are a number of people that are also part and parcel of this webinar, whether they are as participants, whether they are listening in, that would be very, very happy to be part and parcel of community endeavors, so that we can start the partnerships going. Of course, we all understand that eThekwini municipality can't do everything by itself, and that the partnerships are absolutely critical in order to make progress. When I look at the transformative riverine management program that you've got here at the moment, there's so much of room for education in terms of us in the School of Education. And Dr. Angela James as well works closely with that. So I think after this webinar, I would like to see a lot of commitment from people that want to be committed to these kinds of projects. Send us their details. And then we can take this further as a collective. All of us that are sincerely bothered by what we see, and we want change, and we can see some fantastic programs that eThekwini has in place already. But again, to upscale it, you're going to need more effort by more people. And I see immediately Tolly Vezi saying, I am in. And that's what we want. We would love to have more people say, I am in. Please tell us who you are. Send us your details. Send it to Shakila, send it to myself, send it to Sean. We will be, there we go. I'm just saying, I'm in, constantly coming through now. And this is what we want. This is the action I've been trying to drive right from the beginning. And strangely enough, Sean, I must tell you that Zuleka Mkabela is sending a note that she is in, and she's in Poland currently. So this will tell you the extent to which, if we come together, we do have the ability to upscale things and to drive them in a direction that we want to, even if we complain that government is not coming to the party. So I think that if we need to remove certain people or whatever it needs to be, in order for us to ensure that the vulnerable and those who are at risk, as Kathy and Sabu did during this time of the floods, then there will be this buy-in, and we must make this happen. I've taken up time as well. Thank you so much for that, Sean. Looking forward to lots and lots of conversations with all the departments at eThekwini Municipality. We're now going to move to Dr. Papula. Dr. Papula is from UKZN. He is a planner with a lifelong interest in how planning shapes human well-being and livelihood. His research interest centers on inclusivity, land use, city and regional planning, climate change, environmental planning, livelihood studies, etc. In fact, Dr. Papula is part of the team which works with the SACHI chair for inclusive cities. Dr. Papula.
Thank you very much, Prof. Good afternoon, colleagues. Interesting presentation so far. So what I would do in my own presentation is just to try and extray into the land use factor towards how it contributed to flooding incidents in the KZN, and try to extray into the local people context. So you will not blame me if I'm not too philosophical, but to take more of a pragmatic approach in this presentation. So far, the presentation, we have a general overview. I'll try and touch on land use and arrive at a logical reasoning. So far, there's no need for us to keep on emphasizing the effect of the last flooding, either through debt, either through loss of assets, either through disruption in supply chain. All these are some of the effects of the flood. We had that overview last week, and many of the presenters today has also touched on this factor. But one thing that is so common in all the narrative to how flood or how the flooding incidents came about is the narrative here is that land use remains a driver to flood incidents in KZN, whether the particular land use activity or its surrounding activity, whether through deforestation, urbanization, building on floodplains. In whatever way we might say, we can attribute and say that land use factor or how land is being used remains a contributory factor to these flood incidents in KZN. And that brings us to say, okay, then what do we mean by land use? We are talking about any developmental activity or any kind of modification from the existing land use or existing use, how we've modified it over time. And putting into context these recent flood, I will try to extrain into 5 major land use modification that common within KZN that we feel within a strategy for inclusive city, whether through our conversation in our seminars or through our think tank with our chair and others, Professor Magdalena Chipungu, how these modifications has contributed to flood incidents in the entire province. And these flood bomb, as we call it, are issues around informal settlement and wetland disruptions, issues around steep slope development, issues around space commercialization. You must bear in mind that I'm coming from the Sachi Chair for Inclusive City. So my discussion will be mainly from the vulnerable context, how the vulnerable people has contributed to flooding and how we could help manage, putting into context and into consideration their experience. And I think the first presenter touched a little bit on this. And the first one is issues around housing structure extension. And this is a dilemma because as we might see in the place that is marked blue, we see that an RDP house has been provided, but at the same time, these people end up extending it. In most instances, it's because they need more rooms. The rooms are too small for their household. Another instance can be because they need more cash. In instances where there's now backyard rooms. But again, it trickles down to the effect of flood or the incidence of flood because in most instances, it increases runoff. And when there's an increase in runoff, then it trickles down to infrastructure pressure. And when you look at it, when you now talk about waste and sanitation and flood management infrastructure, pressure on it, as identified by our second speaker, this infrastructure end up collapsing, and in some instances, it doesn't end up being managed well. And related to this is issue around waste disposal within our townships. As I mentioned, I would de-emphasize focus on cities and more focused on the township areas or the low-income neighborhood. And these are issues around waste disposal and drain. And I could remember one of the presenters did mention that this is an activity that traces down to the people, not necessarily the government. So I will try to touch on how the people can be integrated into managing the indiscriminate waste disposal and also issues around blockage of drains. And we are almost all the speakers has touched on these, the informal settlement emergence and also wetland destruction. Instances of, but one particular thing that is so peculiar that we've noticed over the years is that when we talk about wetland destruction and informal settlement emergence, most of the time we've often looked at it from the local governance of what's wastewater management within the country. We have failed to learn and begin to discuss the disruption from the disaster planning and management perspective. And this is very important because until these people that reside within this area or that disrupt these spaces begin to see that, look, we need to start considering it as a disaster planning management, they might not actually see why it's so essential to managing flood as a particular form of disaster. And this also speaks to the development along unstable site development, commercialization. You see shops, these are small land use factors that tend to define the rate of flood incidents in our townships where there are incidences of death, which was accounted in most areas. Shops along shops located around the road shoulders, which triggers runoff, disrupt drainage ways, and in most instances, they tend to fasten mud flow and landslide in such areas. So these are some of the factors. And we now arrive and say, look, if we are going to manage these flood incidents sustainably, we have to look at a multidisciplinary strong sense of place. Strong sense of place speaks to the fact that we cannot be talking about city solution for a township solution. And in this, we must also emphasize the communal capacity. And when we talk about communal capacity, that means communities must begin to come together within a social network for collaboration. And in achieving this, we identified and said, look, sustainable designs, development can no longer be ignored. And in doing this, architect builders cannot be working in isolations. Planner as the main discipline that functions in the sustainability and the functionality of environment, rather than aesthetics and beauty, must begin to take the forefront in this. And when we talk about this again, we are talking about builders now trained to begin to look at sustainable materials. There are the questions about the materials that we use in our construction, in our site building. So we might begin to look at that. And I could remember, Prof, you emphasized on this extensively, disaster management within the township in our last discussion. And this has been spoken about, I've been touched on again today, speaking about issues around disaster education, awareness, and consultation within the local area now in this time. Because these vulnerable people need to be involved within this setting. And in doing this, we've looked at, okay, should we now start thinking about stormwater management within a local setting, within each housing unit? Maybe that might be the way to go, because considering the climate change which is coming, there will still be heavy downfall. Should we now be considering stormwater management? Should we also be looking at rainwater harvest? These might look so absurd or too little, as the case is, but there are empirical evidence that point to the fact that these rainwater harvest are some of the mechanisms such that tends to reduce water runoff and tend to reduce incidence of flooding. And on a final note, we identified and said, look, in doing this, going back to the statement which I made, the multi-sectoral and multidisciplinary discussion, inclusivity cannot be ignored. Integration is needed. And when we talk about integration in this context, we are talking about skill set of geographers, of planners, of architects, of every discipline. We now need to come into a forum whereby we need to come together and provide a solution. And I agree with this, and this aligns to the provincial officer that presented in the 4 systems. Thank you, colleagues, and I hope we have a more valid discussion as we go forward. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you so much, Dr. Papula. Our next speaker is Mark Misselhorn, and Mark has been assisting the city for over 2 decades, actually, in upgrading and more recently on some program work related to the city's upgrading strategy. And I'm going to ask him now to speak about his ideas of this incremental planning and alternative tenure, etc. Dr. Papula?
Yes,
I'm going to, yes. Thank you so much.
Right,
Mark,
is my screen sharing okay? And can you hear me?
We can hear you loudly and clearly, and you are sharing your screen. Maybe if you want to go to slideshow and start from the beginning, then it just won't show all of the other little bits along the side.
Right, is that in the correct display mode now?
Perfect.
All right. So what I'll try and touch on is the big picture and how we get ahead of the game. A lot of the work that I'm involved in with the municipality looks at the entire informal settlement upgrading program in the municipality. So what I hope to do is put some of the more specific issues into a broader context and how we develop a programmatic response, not just involving the municipality, but civil society and private sector, so that we transition over time to a far more functional and safe environment in informal settlements. So I'll move quickly through the slides. I was asked to present at relatively short notice, so I've used some slides from prior presentations, so there may be too much detail on some of these, but I think the first thing to understand is the scale of informal settlements in this metro. More than 587 informal settlements, more than 312,000 households. So our ability to respond must be seen in the context of large-scale and rapid urbanization over a sustained period of time, really starting in the 80s, and it's still ongoing. Importantly, almost 80% of the informal settlements are category B1 settlements. Helene touched on and outlined very well the categorization of informal settlements and the approach to upgrading, the new approach to upgrading as per the city's new strategy. So there is a huge issue of scale and responding at scale. And that is just the breakdown of the informal settlements in the municipality by their categorization. You can see the conventional housing delivery is a comparatively small, very costly and very slow moving pipeline of projects, still part of the response. But it would take more than 90 years to address the informal settlement backlog if we were to try and do it with formal housing provision, notwithstanding the scarcity of land and the bulk service and other constraints and the substantial impact on livelihoods that mass relocations would necessitate. So the approach to upgrading is substantially and in line with national policy, focused on the incremental upgrading of informal settlements in situ in ways that minimize relocations, improve tenure security, and improve the quality of life and functionality of the living environments. And eThekwini municipality, I think, is recognized as being one of the leading metros in the country in this regard, in terms of upgrading informal settlements in situ and providing services. So reflecting on the, and maybe, for those who haven't scanned the slide, just to note that aside from basic services, incremental planning arrangements for informal settlements is an important part of the city's response, along with improved forms of tenure security, reblocking and reworking space in informal settlements so that the space is more functional and one can get services into the settlements, and then obviously fast tracking the mitigations on sites and for households that are most severely affected, for example, by flooding. So this is just really a quick reflection on some of the key issues. Many of these have already been touched on by other presenters, but in addition to the scale of informal settlements, and so whatever response we have needs to be scalable. We can't have responses which are really only possible on an isolated small number of settlements. We need to be able to work at scale. But just to highlight that in terms of the nature of the impacts on settlements, it's not just the direct flooding. I think Jeff highlighted this. There was one settlement in particular that was really severely affected, Quarry Road, that's been highlighted, and some others were. But there's also minor and major slope instability, which affects a greater number of settlements. And this is partly because of the steep slopes, but also because of the lack of appropriate engineering controls for these steep sites. And to some extent, possibly the need to improve the stormwater controls off the sites, and that includes some of the things that Jeff was highlighting. There were 23 informal settlements that were most severely impacted. And in terms of how we change this picture, really there are, this has been well articulated in the city's citywide upgrading strategy. But the key thing is to start providing far more proactive incremental services to informal settlements. You'll see there's a bullet point right at the bottom of the page which says that we have to move away from a binary development mindset. I mean, eThekwini, I think, is already very far ahead of many other metros in this regard. But we need to move away from either saying that we provide very basic minimal mitigations and services, or we formalize. We need to have a third path where we intervene more proactively in informal settlements to create more positive change, but that doesn't necessarily mean formalization, which is not possible on most of these sites. So what this really consists of is the provision of a services frame in settlements, getting the main services into the settlement on the main alignments, and including getting good quality footpaths and stormwater controls, along with the related solid waste management, fire hydrants, etc. And I've got pictures just to explain what this looks like practically. So we've got to get better services inside, including stormwater controls. We've got to consider alternative housing approaches. For example, the lift unit, which I will show you just now, which is on stilts, basically, and where we're not cutting into the slope. And then for settlements that are in flood lines, Jeff, I think, has already covered the sorts of early warning and other responses that are already underway in the city and are actually very effective. The bottom line is that the steep sites that are typical of many of the informal settlements in the city can be made habitable and safe and can be upgraded in situ, but we need to have appropriate and alternative ways of providing engineering services and of building on these sites. It's simply not viable to relocate all of these settlements. Where we do need to relocate some households to make space for services, we also need to be able to make ready relocation sites far more quickly. And this really talks to the next bullet, which is about the enabling regulatory flexibility. Currently, the environmental, the planning, and the water use license regulatory processes are extremely slow. So if one needs to move quickly, both to provide improved services inside settlements, as well as to make ready sites where relocations are required, the current regulatory environment simply does not enable us to move quickly enough. So we're forever on the back foot. So here you can see, you've seen lots of pictures of what the floods look like in the watercourses and in the streams. You've seen photos of Quarry Road, but minor landslips and landslides of this nature, these are just some of the settlements we work in, were very common. These will be recurrent impacts unless we start to provide better and more appropriate engineering controls. Slopes of 1 and 3, if appropriate controls are utilized and we don't use conventional cut and fill and steep embankments and retaining walls and access roads, but we have footpaths and more appropriate stormwater controls, those sorts of gradients can be made very stable and habitable with the right sorts of controls. So getting a service frame into a settlement, this is the example of Parkington, which is underway. The design work is finished and hopefully soon to go into implementation. Instead of trying to formalize the whole settlement, which is simply not possible in one go and would result in massive relocations, on the main alignment, services are introduced into the settlement, noting that most of these settlements, in fact 35% of the settlements in the city are best located, are very well located within the prime investment corridor and the urban zone. So these settlements have excellent access to livelihood opportunities, employment and social facilities. So what this does is this establishes the framework for further improvement over time, but gets in the main services before the densities get more difficult. So when completed, there would be footpaths with stormwater controls, solid waste bins, fire hydrants, and mini ablutions inside the settlement. And then the consolidation of these interblocks could be done incrementally over time. Once people have incremental planning and alternative tenure security, we expect that they will have a sufficient incentive to start building differently and better for themselves, and consolidating and improving the quality of the housing stock.
Mark, sorry,
Yes.
If we could round up. Sorry, we don't
Yes,
have much time. Thank you.
Right. So this is what services can look like on the steeper sites with proper stormwater controls. You can see on the right, and making use of, on this particular site, it is in Beleni. These areas here will be lift housing units will be built on these steep sites. And with these controls, there will be good stability of the slope. So just looking at alternative technologies, that's the demonstration lift house at Parkington, which makes use of a lightweight timber frame structure. Lift stands for lightweight, improved, fire-safe timber frame. Meets building standards. It utilizes materials that you can buy at your local hardware store. It's low technology. People can build it for themselves. And because it's double story, it makes use of the limited space. And there's no cut and fill. It goes straight onto the micro power foundations directly into the slope. So it's not just about the services. It's also about people building more responsibly on these steep slopes so that the slope is not destabilized. And this can result over time with an urban form which looks more along the lines of what you're looking at on the screen. I think I will probably leave it there in the interests of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Such exciting projects indeed. We look forward to interacting a little more with you later on. Our last speaker for today is Tashmika Sharma. She is not new. She was here last week and also served as our final speaker. There has been a call for a disaster management plan and an unpacking of this plan. And so I've asked Tashmika to share with us her ideas around this, and we'll give the last few minutes to Tashmika as our last speaker. Please, Tashmika, tell us about this disaster management plan that you have been proposing and what are its ingredients.
Thank you so much, Prof. I really appreciate it. I'm gonna keep to time because I know if I don't keep to time, Prof. Manek is gonna jump through my computer screen and put a muzzle on me. So can you see my screen? Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yes, we can.
So yeah, this is disaster management part 2, and I just brought up the slide from last week just to remind everybody again that 16,000 houses were destroyed. And remember, what I like that everybody's talking about is the marginalized communities who lost their lives, lost their economic livelihoods, cannot transplant it, and really just brings to the forefront for us that when we are planning for a disaster or disaster management, that poverty, unemployment, housing, and urbanization are challenges faced by the city that we cannot exclude from our disaster management plan. And just to reiterate, that these sort of extreme weather events in Southern Africa have been happening since the 1980s. So we should have, had a lot more preparation, bringing early warning systems and mapping to people. And I'm glad that a lot of people here today said it's about accessibility for communities. So I'm just going to try and be quick so I can focus more on disaster management. But last week, I critically discussed the eThekwini's 2009 disaster management plan. And I remember, I didn't get a chance to talk about disaster management sector plan in the IDP, right, our integrated development plan. And this is information taken from the 2020-2021 disaster management plan. And really, I'm not going to read this because it's available to everybody, but it's looking at preventative measures, mitigation phases, and has various different structures which I've highlighted out there in red, right? So the plan does say that these units and these different structures are available in the event of a disaster. But my concern is, as a researcher and somebody who is in policy, is that, how effective is this? And the effectiveness for me is more so relating to speed in terms of response and accessibility in terms of communities, especially the marginalized, right, which is something everybody's talking about in today's presentation. So I did say in the previous presentation, I wanted to see a risk profile. And somebody pointed out to me, there is a risk profile. I went to the IDP and this is it. But when I talk about risk profile, I'm now speaking about, rather than ranking the disasters and doing disaster profiling, I think this needs to be updated. For example, the risk profile should be for each suburb, and we should actually be ranking the variables at risk instead of the most severe disaster. So for example, I'm trying to map out disaster management in South Durban. And one of my major concerns is that the Clarewood Racecourse has been replaced with a logistics park, which means that there's no longer an assembly point. So now my fence line communities then become, the most at risk in terms of my risk ranking profile. And they're also locked by the fact that, there's a lot of trucking activity in the area. So we need to look at zoning, so those are the types of things that I would have liked to have seen. And somebody just said in the previous presentation, people living in a 100-year floodplain. And we've known this information, we had this information. So I don't know why all of a sudden now we come and say, look, people are living in a 100-year floodplain. We should have said this to them, 28 years ago. But when we're talking about disaster management, and remember, climate justice or disaster justice is nothing without social justice. And if there's any theme that resonated with everybody today, it was talking about informal settlements. So that really is our focus here. Urbanization is a challenge. We already have so many maps. We saw such wonderful maps from, everybody at the eThekwini municipality who presented just now, showing us the location of informal settlements, high-risk areas, whether it was slope stability, etc. So how do we use this? We need to use this in a manner that's integrated, in a manner that's accessible. And I'm a very big believer in actually literally doing something. I don't, and I always say, I said it last week, I don't like coming with big academic jargon. And when I write policies, I don't like using big words because it doesn't mean anything to the layman or the people, who don't speak English, etc. So when we go into informal settlements, what do you do? What do you actually do? We need to appoint a task team, right? That's going to go to informal settlements and form a management committee to manage their areas, right? I like that. I think it was Jeff who brought in this issue of waste management, because I thought today I was going to be the only one that was going to speak about it. I don't know why nobody brought it up previously. But we saw waste management services really needed to come to the forefront because of the debris that caused a lot of destruction and played a role in actually drowning some of the people in the informal settlements. We need to form task teams with these informal settlements. We need to appoint leaders within informal settlements. We need to be interacting with them, on a monthly basis, etc. We need to keep an inventory of them. Right now, we lost 500,000 people 2 weeks ago. We're still looking for some dead bodies. We don't know who passed away, who didn't, how many are adults, who are children. So it's fine that, we have all these maps. You can see they've mapped out here in KwaZulu-Natal in, 2017, the Department of Treasury mapped out where these informal settlements are, giving you a more clearer picture in the middle here. But this doesn't mean anything if I'm not going to go into these settlements and create an inventory, interact with them, find out what I actually need to do. Okay. And, I bring up this thing where I say poverty before privilege. I'm sitting here with the draft budget for IDP, which says 54.6 billion Rand being invested into the city. Now, if we cannot house people in Durban, because that's the big issue, informal settlements is because we cannot house them, right? Then we need to re-look at how we're going to align this funding. So I'm now saying we don't need to invest that much further into Durban. We don't need another Amhlanga. We don't need another arbor crossing or more investment into a beachfront. We need to take employment opportunities to Inchanga and Mzinyati and Hazelmere. It will alleviate the housing pressure on Durban and, of course, local government and provincial government. Because we cannot be in a situation, remember I said disaster justice is about social justice. We cannot be in a situation where we give communities a Hobson's choice when it comes to the city. Either they are coming to the city to find employment and they're going to stay in the informal dwelling, or they're not going to have access to the city's employment at all. Where will that leave them? And if they are staying in informal settlements, then in the event of a disaster, they are the ones who are most affected by the sheer fact that they are marginalized, right? So
Shmika, you are going to be so upset with me, but I'm going to have to ask. I'm coming. I'm
at the end, Prof. I'm at the end, yeah. So we really need to look at realigning the funding, and we really need to look at moving our economic activities outside of Durban, right? And then creating tax incentives for businesses to form, rural economic nodes or economic nodes outside of Durban. So that's how we we get rid of this issue when it comes to informal settlements. But getting to the disaster management plan, and I kept on saying last week, it's an integrated approach. Integrated means it, integrates education, pollution, health, and safety. And I've got it written there, so I'm not going to, read it to everybody. I'm just going to talk through it very quickly in the interest of time, Prof. And I said it's a multi-layered approach. We're going for preventative rather than curative. Remember, when you're writing a policy, out of a philosophy comes a policy. Out of a policy comes a procedure. If the thinking is not right, everything's not going to follow through. So I said strategic mapping. We need roads, emergency exits. The municipality has done the legwork. That's clear. Okay, I think Dr. Pupula also pointed that out in this map on the left here. Spatial planning needs to come together with the Department of Transport, academics, Prof touched on that, land use planning, because we know where the most high-risk areas are. Waste management, and Jeff spoke about that. I spoke about it earlier as well. The rescue teams, they should know and be allocated to certain areas, disaster management centers, and I think Dr. Pupula touched on this as well, should not only be in the city, it should be at your nearest police station, it should be in rural areas, and when the disaster happens, we shouldn't then wake up and say, oh, what do we do now? Rescue teams should already know the areas they're allocated to. I mentioned this last week as well, Department of Education, working, government board, changing the school curriculum, using community halls and school halls. First aid should be, compulsory. And Department of Social Development, working together with community-based organizations, civil society organizations, faith-based organizations. And again, then just bringing, Treasury in to realign our funding, the Department of Labor to relocate employment opportunities so people don't have to, await their death in a disaster, in an informal settlement. And then, of course, bringing to you this notion of occupational health and safety that should be coming, through the Department of Labor. So this is what I want to see in a disaster management plan, that every single department comes in, that they have a specific role to play, right? That it is integrated, that they are allocated to specific suburbs, and then accessibility becomes important. We need to print this disaster management plan. You need to hand it to everybody. It needs to be in Zulu or in all 11 official languages. And, it needs to be distributed in mass. So I really want to see...
Tashmika, we're going to allow you to actually take us through that. I think what we've been doing is pooling all our assets from this webinar. Loads and loads of people have already given their commitment. You're going to come with your disaster management plan to that meeting as well. And that's where this webinar is going to move to next. So thank you so much for your effort. And we hope that it's going to lead to some phenomenal things in the municipality and for people's lives as well. I think our biggest takeaway today is that you can't continue to create stress in the urban area. It's just an impossible thing. There will just never be enough funding and enough money to do so. What we have to seriously start to consider in the city is decentralization. Make rural areas attractive. That is the long-term plan. And that should be the long-term plan that attracts funding. If you make rural areas attractive, rural urban migration will decrease because the jobs will be in these other areas that you've spoken about. Thank you so much for that, Tashmika, and for your presentation. I want to move to just one or two questions because I think that although this is the last webinar for the series in terms of the KZN floods, we are going to far too many people have already spoken about wanting to be part and parcel of action that we are going to take. And in terms of this, the idea is that we do have structures in place, we've seen it, but they're not effective as a number of people have already alluded to. There's a need for education, awareness, there's a need for greater communication, there's this need for disaster management units in townships, as has been pointed out, or what Tashmika likes to call task teams as well, the same idea. And it's about integrating all of these things. So let's go to one or two questions now. I want to take a question. Jeff has already left, but perhaps some of his colleagues will be able to just respond on, if they are able to, how often is maintenance of rivers and stormwater drainage conducted physically? Is anybody able to throw some light on this? Or is that a question that unfortunately only Jeff could answer? And he's just left for a meeting with the Deputy Mayor.
Professor Zada, so I'm not sure about stormwater drainage and like that, but I can tell you that the Siklanzi and Belo program, which the TRMP is based on, has grown from about 300 kilometers of stream over 10 years to now it's over 500 kilometers of stream. And that happens all the time with people, cooperatives managing those streams. It's a 3-year contract that gets renewed obviously every 3 years. And it's growing. So the idea now is that we move from where we are with that to, in an incremental way, to all 7,000 kilometers of streams. But that's going to take us a few years to get right, and it'll need quite specific governance mechanism, probably a non-profit company working with the city to achieve, because a lot of the land is not owned by the city, so we can't spend money where we don't own land. But it is, so it needs that partnership approach.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So I suppose one of the other questions, which was about the responsibility of rivers and maintenance, that is something that we can also then say, well, indeed, we can pursue this a little later in other discussions as well, in terms of the engagements between communities together with the municipality. And of course, when we're thinking of upscaling some of these programs as well. Is there anyone who has a burning question that they would like to ask? I will allow one question from the audience now. And I think, let me take a question from Dres on whether the Quarry Road early warning system is scalable. Anybody has an idea about this? Can we upscale that?
I'd be happy to have a go at that. You know, and Mark put his finger on it. He nailed it. It's very difficult to do this across all 550 informal settlements. But you know, one way it could be done is by training members, community leaders from the settlements to be a group, and you know, just to form these WhatsApp groups within the settlements. With that, then it becomes a more manageable bite. So yeah, it would need to be done through a process of building capacity within leaders of the different informal settlements, and then linking them with the formal few systems. So I believe it could be done, but it wouldn't be easy.
Okay, and we're going to try and make things a little easier because we've got commitments from so many people to be part and parcel of taking all of the concerns forward with some form of action. So I'm going to start setting up within the next week a meeting that's going to be eThekwini municipality together with university researchers, and I think there's a whole list of NGOs that have already committed and individuals as well. So let's see how we can start to create these wonderful partnerships. And I think we've run again over time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to end, and then I'm going to ask Arariso Sabanda just to do the vote of thanks for us. We've seen numerous calls to hold particular people responsible and accountable like government. But I think what's emerging quite significantly is that we're now starting to hold ourselves accountable. And this is just marvelous because there's a commitment by so many people here that we need to act. We need to form these networks. We need to regroup. We need to craft these avenues for there to be change. And I think this aligns to what Dr. Suleiman of the Gift of the Givers has been talking about active citizenship. I think this is very, very much in line with what he's been speaking about. In fact, if I'd like to just quote from him, he said, we need 4 principles to fix this country. We don't need money. We need spirituality, we need morality, we need values and ethics. You fix that, you fix the country. We'll have a surplus of money overflowing because you'll do the things the right way, in an honest way with integrity. And the moment you do that, in Islam, he says it's called barakat, blessings, bounties, and abundance. And so that's his quote. I think it's a lesson for all of us. And they are individuals that are also driving this. So it's not only about forming these networks. As individuals, we can also do so. We've also just heard about Satguru from the Isha Foundation, traveling on his motorbike for what's called Save the Soil. It's the Save the Soil movement. Speaking to soil extinction, something that we've never heard of before. Again, linking it to climate change and food security, not just anywhere else like in the UK or India where he's currently traveling, but also for Africa. So I think that there's a lot of work that we can do, and we can do it as individuals, but also in terms of coming together and regrouping. Thank you so much for attending. I now hand you over to Arariso Sabanda, who will soon be graduating actually with his PhD in environmental education. And I'm sure he's going to be joining us on this next journey. Arariso, please do the vote of thanks for us.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to everyone for making the time and effort to attend today's webinar. All thanks goes to all the guest speakers. And I would like to quote Linda, who said, let's stop the blame game. And I think this message has to be conveyed to the general public. Geoff also echoed the same sentiments, and he said, it's not all about the government, but government and communities working together. Thanks to the audience for your participation and information you posted on the chat box. There was an insightful conversation about conscientizing everyone that the current floods, they cannot only be attributed to climate change. There are some factors. And I think that conversation followed what Geoff said about climate having a minimal role on the issue of the floods. Thanks to our host, Professor Sadan from the UKZN Geography Department and the UKZN Corporate Relations for planning this event. Thank you everyone, once again, for making this event a great success. Thank you, Prof.
Once again, stay blessed, everyone. Take care, and I'm sure I will be meeting with the majority of you very soon. Goodbye.
Cheers, everyone.